Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel. College football season continues to dwindle down, and the stakes get ratcheted up. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider.
We had to do some work this week to have a college football podcast.
That's putting it mildly, I think, to try and figure out what we could find amongst the dregs, games that were even worth discussing. Tough.
But we're going to battle through it. We're going to make the best of it as we have all season, navigate the waters. And I think we have a good show today.
It's all about fighting through adversity this time of year. Hit a little Heisman, talk a little look-ahead lines. We'll make all the listeners smarter, like we try to do our best every single week we jump on these fine airwaves. And Payne, I think what's interesting is we look at how things are going to play out over the next couple weeks. The ACC yesterday decides, hey, look, we want to try and protect the two most prominent brands that we have in our league. And they just go, hell with it. We're just going to cancel Notre Dame's game against Wake Forest and allow them to be evaluated on a 9-game schedule along with Clemson and Miami. So all of a sudden, Clemson, win and you're in, and you'll take on Notre Dame and get a bye week in the ACC title.
Nothing wrong with that approach. I don't mind it. Makes a lot of sense.
I'm surprised some of these leagues haven't done that sooner.
Got to navigate the COVID waters. That's it. Just make up excuses and then move teams forward. I didn't hear Dabo say anything about that, though.
Yeah, well, I don't know what Dabo's been chirping off about one way or another. I'm sick of listening to that guy. Now, he's built one hell of a program, but doesn't mean I need to listen to him talk in any capacity about what's going on or try and interject his opinions that don't carry much weight. But that game was interesting because obviously it'll be a revenge scenario for the Clemson Tigers. We'll have Trevor Lawrence back. And we talked to John Sheeran, and he got in touch with the good old risk management team at FanDuel. And their opening number they project to use on that game is Clemson -10. In your opinion, fair or foul with a number that big?
Pretty fair. The closing line with DJ at Notre Dame was, what, 5-ish? In that area?
Yeah, it was in that dead zone between 4.5 and 6, so 5.5, depending on the shop, I believe.
And so now you're going to a neutral field, and you have Trevor Lawrence, and the one element that we have constantly pounded the table about was Notre Dame's inability to defend the deep pass. And we thought that Clemson showed pretty well there through the air. I believe it was over 9 yards per pass attempt, just 1.8 per carry, and yet they decided to run the ball a little bit too often. So I think you'll see a different game plan from Clemson coming into that one. But it's still going to be a very good game. Still some question marks about Clemson's defense. The number for me, not too far off.
Yeah, what's interesting about that game, too, is that Clark Lee apparently towards the top of Vanderbilt's wish list, Notre Dame's defensive coordinator, as a potential head coaching replacement for Derek Mason. You wonder how that could factor in when they have 2 weeks to try and navigate through some of those troubled waters. But you'd have to imagine that the Irish, if they're competitive in that game with what we've seen from the college football rankings, they lose that game by a touchdown. They have to be one of the 4 teams in the college football playoff, right?
Really?
I mean, I'm asking because I'm trying to figure out who would jump over them in a scenario where Ohio State, hey, that situation will be very interesting to see how that unfolds.
Should that be interesting at all, though? And I ask this seriously because and the only reason I'm saying this is because last year we had the commissioner come on and talk how important this 13th data point was. And now all of a sudden, a year later, we're like, okay, this team with potentially 4 games is getting in over a team that's played 9.
Oh, I don't think they should, and I don't think they're that dominant. I saw enough against Indiana that leads me to believe this Ohio State team is extremely vulnerable to compared to previous editions.
Without question. So just looking at this, we didn't adjust our top 10 at all last week. Nothing changed. I saw the committee didn't change anything from 7 and above. We do have Notre Dame power rated higher than the Floridas and the Oklahomas. Now, obviously, that could change. What if Florida runs the table?
Well, Florida runs the table. Florida's in. So Alabama with 1 loss is
Yep.
in. Florida runs the table. They're in. And then it's where it gets interesting because you ultimately have a decision, you would think, for 3 teams competing for 2 spots. And those 3 teams being Notre Dame, Clemson, and, of course, the aforementioned Buckeyes.
Yeah, that will be interesting.
And if that's the case, and we play this out, Notre Dame plays Clemson. Let's say they lose by a touchdown in Charlotte. In my opinion, Clemson and Notre Dame should both get in over Ohio State. That would only be 5-0, even 6-0 if they beat Wisconsin on a championship Saturday scenario.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
So, I mean, you look at the different scenarios that could work out that way. It's just interesting to think. And I got absolutely crushed on social media for saying that if I'm Michigan, given how petty college sports are, I say the hell with it. I try and screw Ohio State. We're not going to beat you on the field. We're just not going to show up for the game and allow the Big Ten to try and wiggle themselves out of the mess that they've created for themselves, where Ohio State can't play in the conference championship and get that 13th data point that you mentioned.
I saw that tweet. Wasn't much love, but now that I am aware that you are a guy that plays dirty behind the scenes and keep yourself clean in front of people, I mean, newfound respect for you.
Hey, I mean, let's be honest here. Everyone who wants to take this holier than thou or the kids should go out there and earn it on the field, that percentage of the population cracks me up because those are the same idiots that were calling to try and turn in. Hold on. They're the same people that were trying to call in and turn in other programs in your own league, trying to figure out, hey, yeah, we're all for advocating. Oh, well, it's a participation trophy. These kids transfer when they can't win the starting job out of camp. And you're going to talk about a participation trophy or somehow Jim Harbaugh and Michigan should be above this particular scenario, knowing they go into that game as 4 or 5 touchdown underdogs and get absolutely bludgeoned like they do every year? No, screw Ohio State. We're not going to play the game, and we're going to let you sort it out with the conference.
I like it. Savvy move there. Absolute savage mode.
Fight dirty. You have to fight dirty. It's college athletics. Nothing's above board.
That is true. That is true. Aside from politics, college sports is probably the dirtiest environment there is. There might not be a dirtier industry than college athletics, but
I don't think there is.
I'm still going politics, but I think it's college athletics for 1B.
I mean, what's the expression? There's no honor amongst thieves or honor amongst thieves. I never get that one right.
You're not very good with the quotables, but I think you're on the same page.
I'm not very good with a lot of things. And that's what happens when we record this thing early in the morning. But the reality of it is, I mean, college athletics in general aren't exactly a clean, upstanding business run by Boy Scouts as you look at what it takes to win and compete at the highest level.
Especially once these contracts for coaches got so inflated. It's all about winning. And so that's just going to enhance the cheating a little bit. That's where it's at.
I just want to know how much money Texas is going to offer Urban Meyer to get him out of the Fox booth and down there into Austin to try and resurrect that program that's become a dumpster fire.
If Tom Herman didn't botch that end game so poorly and Texas somehow wins, is Herman still at Texas? If you're a Texas fan, that might have actually been a positive.
I mean, how many lifelines do you want to give the guy? Every year, Texas fans watch them win a bowl game, a second-tier bowl game where their opponent doesn't want to be there. Utah last year, I can't remember who the year before. Hey, we're going to get things turned around. Yeah, Georgia the year before. And full disclosure, I'm an idiot. I bought into Texas before this season. I thought the defense was going to be better. I thought the offense could show some improvement. I'm an idiot. You could put a giant L on my forehead because there's video out there of me picking them as a dark horse to win the national championship. I own it. Old takes exposed. Anybody on Twitter who wants to drum it up, I own it. I'm a moron. I advocated for Texas as a dark horse national champion contender, and the only dark horse they are is one that can't get out of their own way to win meaningful games in conference.
Yeah, he's got to go, I think. It's time. Although no one's really been able to win there since Mac Brown, and it's something that we've talked about a couple times here or there. Just the talent isn't to the level that people believe it is. And I think now that Tom Herman lost his prized quarterback recruit, there's really no reason to retain him.
Yeah, I mean, the reality of it is the talent there, I think, has been a little inflated in terms of their overall ratings, but you still have to coach up the talent that you get in there, and none of the last couple of coaches down there in Austin have been able to do it. But that'll take us on a tangent and an area where I'm not sure we should go to, because we talked about the Clemson Notre Dame and the look-ahead line there. We were also sent a look-ahead number for the SEC championship game, and this number, I don't want to say surprised me, Payne, but it might surprise some of our listeners, with Alabama projected out to a 13-point chalk against Florida in Atlanta.
Which way do you believe that surprises people?
I think it would surprise people that Florida is catching 13 in that spot, knowing that Kyle Trask is the odds-on favorite right now to win the Heisman Trophy ahead of Mac Jones. All the talk about Dan Mullen and that high-powered offense, and that when you're laying a number like that the back door could still be open. Do I think it's a fair number? Yes, because I think this Alabama defense that we wanted to bury after Ole Miss went up and down the field on them weeks ago, that's a distant memory, and that was the side of the ball we had questions on. They've answered a lot of those questions, and I think they're the most balanced and complete team in all college football.
They are getting a little more organized on that side of the football. I will say this, looking at our number there, we're at 11.8 on the game. Before we hopped on the podcast, I saw Connolly tweet out that he made it 11. So we're understanding that it should be double digits. We're not quite there that it should be 2 touchdowns. I know we want to talk Trask versus Mac Jones, and maybe we transition to that now because I'll be candid, right? I don't love all of this kind of talk that isn't totally actionable or have a ton of value. And the Heisman isn't my bag, but I think we can attack this to where there is some value if we want to go that route and kind of incorporate this Bama Florida potential line.
Yeah, I think all of it's kind of baked in together, and I more or less joked, and there's obviously some level of sincerity in it, that if Kyle Trask is ultimately going to win the Heisman Trophy, I think it's actually contingent on Florida beating Alabama. So I said, if you believe that Trask is the guy, and he's got to do it on one of the biggest stages, it may make more sense to bet Florida in a money line in a one-game scenario than it is to run to the window at FanDuel and lay $1.25 or $1.30 on Trask. But I don't want to diminish anything that he's been able to accomplish throughout the course of the regular season, because the numbers don't lie, and the figures he's putting up leading the Gators this year, quite frankly, are on par with what Joe Burrow did last year in his tremendous campaign down there in Baton Rouge.
So I went down a wormhole and spent incredibly too much time on this, and obviously we know both these quarterbacks are fantastic, and I think I pounded the table for both of them. If you remember, in the preseason and even early on this year, we had some, I would say, sophisticated college football minds label Mac Jones a game manager, and we nipped that in the bud pretty quickly. And then a few weeks into the season, there was some respected analytics guys that were like, Kyle Trask isn't that great because a lot of his numbers are run after the catch from the receivers, and Dan Mullen's got this great system. I like both quarterbacks. We're splitting hairs here, but if I had to vote, the things that I would look at and consider would be the schedule. There's a lot of common opponents. There's a couple key metrics that I like looking at, and then I think you also have to look at the opportunity. And so, digging into this yesterday, the schedule is extremely similar. Trask has played passing defenses that rank 72nd on average in EPA. Mac Jones, 69th. There's a handful of the common opponents, but I think the obvious one, right, is the A&M game. A&M? Right, yeah. You have Kyle Trask and the Gators lose that game outright as a favorite. Mac Jones and Alabama not only beat A&M, but they won by 28. They exceeded the expectations. They covered the spread there. If you look at some of the metrics, whether it's, when they're pressured or kept clean or even deep passing, again, you're splitting some hairs there. Trask and Mac are virtually identical in all those categories. Adjusted completion percentage, passer rating. Even if you look at, success rate and explosive passing, they're like mirror images of each other. But the one thing that I kind of found in digging into this is the opportunity. And I think that's really interesting and worth mentioning because Alabama right now, they're passing on 46% of their offensive snaps. Florida's at 54%. Mac Jones has attempted 46 fewer passes than Kyle Trask. So if you look at this from a generic stat perspective, like passing yards, which I think a lot of voters will do, okay? So Trask is only leading by 100 passing yards there. If you look at Mac Jones, he's averaging 12 yards per pass attempt. So if they had the same opportunity, you'd see Mac Jones having 400 or 500 more passing yards. And it's against a slightly better schedule of passing defenses when you look at EPA. But here's what's interesting, and you kind of gave the one scenario, if you liked Florida, that you could back Trask. For me, and I think a lot of our listeners know this, I don't love investing in these high-hold markets. It's pretty much against my religion. And Heisman odds kind of fit into that, especially where we're at this stage. It's about a 25% hold. So there has to be more value there than a regular bet. But if you're looking at Trask, you're looking at Mac Jones, and I play this out in my head, I personally already lean Mac Jones. I'd make him a slight favorite. So if you can get plus 160 on Mac Jones, that's interesting, especially if limits aren't a problem for you. But you dig into this even a little bit further. They announced that they're going to award the Heisman on January 5th. The SEC championship game scheduled for December 19th. I looked at some backdated data. Only about 11% of Heisman voters enter their ballot early. So almost 90% of voters are going to wait until the games are completed. So it looks like at this point, Florida and Alabama are on that collision course for the SEC championship game. Alabama, again, John at FanDuel makes them a 13-point favorite. So if you look at this and you take Mac Jones plus 160 to win the Heisman, that's obviously better than laying double digits with Bama. If Bama's undefeated and wins head-to-head, it's tough for me to envision voters giving the Heisman to a two-loss Trask with numbers so close. But also think about this. It gives you opportunity if you want to roll the dice, right? You make Mac Jones plus 160 to win the Heisman. You take that. You then have an opportunity to middle this game, essentially.
Yeah, you take the points with the Gators, you back them on the money line to lock in something.
Yeah, you can take Mac Jones to win the Heisman plus 160. If you're not feeling as comfortable, game day rolls around, all of a sudden you're taking Florida plus the 13 if that's what the number looks like. If Florida somehow isn't in the game, it's probably your plus 160 on Mac is good as well. But you at least have opportunity here to take Mac plus the 160 to win Heisman. You can come back if they're playing Florida and take the 13. And if you get Alabama winning in this shootout by 3, 7, 10, you have a good chance to win both these bets.
Well, and I think what's interesting, too, and we're not going to really preview the Alabama-LSU debacle, Mac Jones will have one of the biggest stages in college football on Saturday night. I mean, there's no competition. It's an LSU team that they lost to a season ago, and while the Tigers don't exactly command a whole lot of respect defensively, if Mac goes out there in a game that's nationally televised on CBS and throws for 5 touchdowns, I think all of a sudden we're talking about him again. I know Kyle Trask plays Tennessee earlier in the day on CBS as well. But I think it's fascinating because the Heisman isn't always necessarily about the best player. It's about the best storyline. It's about that Heisman moment. The one thing I will say, Payne, which has been interesting, and I'm always surprised when I read this that comes from smart college football players, smart college football journalists and whatnot, that it's that it's hard to give Mac Jones the Heisman if he's not the best player on his team, obviously indicating that Najee Harris has had a great season and Devontae Smith are there. But for that argument to hold water, that would say that Kyle Trask was doing it without a guy like Kyle Pitts, who's more or less provides a matchup nightmare every time Florida straps on the helmet.
And Tony's taken that next step, and you have Dan Mullen. The interesting part about this is, and we can always debate this, there is always going to be better, more talented players than the quarterback, but the quarterback's the most valuable. It's the engine to the car. So everyone first said Mac Jones was a game manager. And then you look at all his numbers and all his metrics, and he's picking up right where Tua left off, who ended up being a top 10 draft pick. So, yeah, I don't get that. I don't understand that. The odds have clearly shrunk, right? He was like 3-1 last week. You mentioned if he shows up, even though LSU's dog shit this year, and I think we have them 32 points worse than last year's version of LSU. But the branding of that on national TV and that spotlight, as you alluded to, if Mac goes out there and throws for 5 touchdowns, game on. And I get that this is more of an individual award, but I don't think you can overlook Mac Jones and Alabama beating Florida and beating the common opponent and having similar numbers. They are really similar numbers. The only thing that Kyle Trask is head and shoulders above Mac Jones on is passing touchdowns. And it's because they do have a little bit more of a relevant running game where Najee Harris is able to do some things, inside the red zone. That's the only difference. Everything else is virtually identical. And again, it comes down to that opportunity rate, and that's why I mentioned it. If Mac Jones has another 46 pass attempts on par with Kyle Trask, the numbers are overwhelmingly actually in favor of Mac Jones.
Yeah, I mean, 46 attempts is another complete football game, if you think about it in that particular context where he's out there throwing. And the reality of it is, yes, this is an individual award, but if you look at history, the best player on the best team typically wins this thing. You don't see somebody coming from a 6-6 side, or even 8-2, 8-3 isn't enough to try and get you there. It's having an unblemished record, being the most valuable player on your team, and I think it's a fascinating discussion to have, not necessarily because they're truly actionable elements, but when you lay out scenarios about how our listeners can take advantage on the FanDuel Sportsbook app and look to try and bet this. If you grab Mac Jones at plus odds, he comes out there. There's a good chance he could be a favorite going into that game. You back it up with Florida in some capacity and maybe lock yourself into a profit.
Yeah, not a bad situation to be in there.
So, and that's kind of the name of the game in this particular business. If you can do some risk-free gambling, it's what we all aspire to. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You, of course, can follow me there as well. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Payne, we've been good to the group of five in 2020.
You're coming around.
And we're going to be
You're coming around.
No, well, I don't know if I'm quite coming around yet. I'm still a fan of the Blue Bloods and the power programs. Let's call a spade a spade. But we do have a showdown of two teams that have been a couple of the biggest surprises in college football. And Game Day, of course, will take their show to Myrtle Beach this Saturday for Liberty and Coastal Carolina. When you look at these two teams, familiar foes, so to speak, as they're reigniting a rivalry of former Big South teams that played annually from 2003 to 2016. This number's been on the move at FanDuel, and right now we're seeing Coastal Carolina a 9.5-point favorite. Total in this game is 55, down from 57 on the open. The side is up from where it opened at -6. All sorts of rumors swirling about the availability of Liberty starting quarterback Malik Willis. I don't really want to necessarily get in there. Nothing bad. All COVID-related speculation going on at that point. I don't want people to think he got in legal trouble or anything along those lines. So that partially explains the move. But Payne, when we look at this particular game, we've talked about Coastal and how they do things the right way so far this season, don't beat themselves. The reality of it is this Liberty defense, in my opinion, and I think yours, hasn't been tested all season long. You look at the opponents that they faced, NC State and Virginia Tech, the only two teams that they've had to go against that had offenses in the top 100, and Virginia Tech, the only team inside the top 70. Does Liberty have enough on the defensive side of the ball to get consistent stops and keep this game competitive?
Because I'm a G5 guy, I am carrying the torch.
Well, Florida State,
Florida
State might get relegated to G5 status, so you're going to have to be a G5 guy. Those might be the only wins you guys get the next 3 to 5 years.
We'll see what comes of it. Certainly has not been a good week with more opt-outs and decommitments. Has not been pleasant. I'm so confused by that, by the way. Like, if you just ask Kirk Herbstreit, hey, go into a room, write down your top 10 college football programs. Florida State's in the top 10 still. Not obviously record-wise, not where the program's at now, but it's one of like the 10 best college football programs there is. And we're like losing recruits to like Ole Miss. Like, it's just wild to me. Either way here, like, this is going to be a fun game. I'm glad Game Day is going to a smaller school. Two really deserving teams. I think we've talked about Hugh Freeze. He's resurrected his career, came out this week. I believe he said he's not leaving. Jamie Chadwell, we've loved. I think he's one of the hottest names in college football. You have two dynamic offenses that are going to be really tough to defend. And if you're looking at EPA, Coastal's number 12th in the country, Liberty number 13 in terms of offensive EPA. Both offenses are pretty balanced, top 20 in overall success rate. Both can hit the big play, top 20 in explosiveness. So I think you hit this perfectly. The key here is which of the defenses can get the occasional stop, which can hold the 3 or maybe get that key turnover to put it back in the offensive hands to kind of, steal that extra possession or two. The thing that stands out when I compare both defenses is both are not great stopping the run, but the difference is Liberty gives up like these gobs of explosive plays. And that's the one difference. Liberty is 79th in the country in explosive play rate allowed, 94th. An explosive run D, 63rd in explosive pass D. You mentioned it's not against a great schedule of offenses, and we've already talked about how dynamic these two offenses are. For Coastal's defense, they're 15th allowing the big play. So that's the little bit of the dichotomy here. And I get it. Down-to-down efficiency is more predictive. There's the luck element to explosive plays. But why this is important to me is if we're talking about the defense is needing that crucial stop or, getting a turnover, the offense that's forced to go 10, 12, 14 plays to score probably, has the better chance of getting stopped or turning it over or having that costly penalty that forces you into those longer down and distances. The other thing that stands out here, Todd, in terms of defenses which might be more capable of getting the stop, is Coastal's defense is better creating the havoc plays. And they're also better allowing havoc plays. So again, if you can somehow get your opponent in that 2nd and 12 or the 3rd and 8 because, first or 2nd down, you created a havoc play behind the line of scrimmage, that's probably what it's going to take to get that, 1 or 2 crucial stops a half. Metrically speaking, and from what I've seen, this just feels like Coastal will have a better chance getting that occasional stop. Also something to monitor here for Liberty's defense. Their linebacker, Anthony Butler, easily Liberty's best defender. He missed the UMass game last week. He's questionable for this game. He's one of the best cover linebackers in the country. That would be a massive loss if Butler isn't out there for Liberty's defense. You hinted at this, and we'll just kind of, put it out there. Like, Coastal got hit last night. I would say later in the evening, -7. I saw a group come in and take it. We're now out to 10.5, yet the total is coming down. So there are some things leaking out there that Liberty's quarterback, Malik Willis, potentially has COVID. So we'll see what comes of that. But certainly, the total shooting up 3.5 points, even 4, like it opened 6 some places. So you're talking about a 4.5 point move through the 7 and the 10 while the total's coming down. It would lead to some credence in that rumor, I would say.
Always interesting to try and chase the rumor mill that is college football. Just sharing some intel that may or may not be out there. But yeah, the market clearly suggests that Liberty at this point could potentially go into this game not being at full strength. Take it for what you will. Yes. Do your research on your own and ultimately arrive at your own conclusions. But either way, good to see two
Here's the interesting thing about this move as well, to kind of elaborate that there's something else going on here. And full disclosure, Todd, I think, Coastal is one of the larger movers this entire season in terms of where we started them to where they are now. I think we've adjusted them 17.5 points since the start of the season, and it still hasn't.
That's pretty good.
It still hasn't been enough. I mean, last week we took Texas State plus 18 and 17.5. Another group came behind us and took 17. It's why it closed 6. The game doesn't have a prayer. So my point in saying that is, we think the team that wise guys have faded the last few weeks that could be a little bit overvalued is suddenly getting pounded this week. It would, again, lead you to believe that there's something going on here with this game.
Yeah, keep in mind that these two teams, if you bet them blindly this season, 15-3-1 against the number, depending on what your closing line value look like. So Liberty and Coastal have done well by their backers so far this season. Always interesting to try and see which teams the odds makers can't price correctly, and these two appear to be poster children for such an illustration. One team that hasn't exactly helped line their bettors' wallets has been the Tennessee Volunteers. And when you look at this number in Knoxville this weekend at Neyland Stadium, Tennessee enters against the Florida Gators as a 17.5 point underdog at FanDuel. Total on this game sits at 61.5. This will be the biggest number in this long-standing rivalry over the last 10 years. First time this matchup won't be played in September since 2014. When you look at Florida, they've actually been good away from Gainesville, going 6-3 against the number the last 9 times on the highway. And the last 2 meetings between these programs, well, they haven't exactly been competitive. Florida's won the last 2 years by a combined score margin of 81-24. Payne, this was supposed to be the year that Jeremy Pruitt and Tennessee turned the corner. They started out the season with 2 big wins, scoring 30-plus points in both of those games. Since then, it's been nothing but disaster. 21 or less in the last 5 games. They haven't scored more than 17 points in each of their last 4 games. Is this the opportunity where Tennessee can get healthy? And I'm not calling for an outright win, but a cover to keep their fan base happy. And can the offense be the catalyst for doing that against an overrated and sometimes underwhelming Florida defense?
The demise started in the second half of that Georgia game.
That's what happens. Our bettors know that game all too well. We should have been first half in and out of Dodge.
I mean, they looked like a team that was top 20 in that first half. And we haven't seen that team since. So I'm not sure what Tennessee is. And when you think of Jeremy Pruitt, you think of defense. And you go back in time, he was actually FSU's defensive coordinator under Jimbo for the championship in 13. Then Pruitt won 2 more as Bama's DC in 15 and 17. And you look at some of these recruiting classes, you're like, oh, Pruitt's bringing in some defensive talent. But that's the side of the ball that's been horrible. you're like, oh, there's question marks at quarterback. Garantano isn't that guy. Tennessee's got problems on offense. But, like, what's going on with the defense? This is another team that doesn't have the identity of its head coach. And you look right now, 85th in EPA per play defense for Tennessee. 105th in overall success rate allowed. 123rd in explosive pass defense for the Vols. And you had just last night, Todd Pruitt's best defensive player was kicked off the team. Kevon Bennett was arrested for this gun and drug charge, apparently, and he's not going to play, obviously. He led the Vols in pressures. He made 12 plays behind the line of scrimmage. He even had the defensive touchdown, I believe, in the Georgia game. So that's a huge loss. Tennessee isn't getting stops in this game, so the key for me to staying within this 17.5 number is the offense. Tennessee is going to have to somehow keep up, and I'm sure the goal is to shorten the game, help the defense out, keep Florida's offense off the field, get the ground game going. Maybe Tennessee's O-line does a good job getting some push up front and controlling the trenches. And even though the entire world knows they want to run the ball, they've still done a decent job pushing some guys around. The Vols are 24th in line yards. Florida's defense has been real susceptible to the ground game, 108th in the country in rushing success rate allowed, 74th in explosive run defense. So you're looking at guys like Eric Gray. He has to have a day here. Ty Chandler needs to contribute as well. The other thing that, and we talked about this, I think, Monday off air, like, are we going to be forced to play Tennessee here? The reason this has gone through the 17 is, aside from the suspension last night to Bennett, the Vols' best defensive player, there's another little speed bump here. Pruitt said one of his quarterbacks could be impacted by COVID. He wouldn't say Garantano, but that's kind of the insinuation. I'm not sure it would get brought up if it was the third string kid. So I think we have to monitor that as well from now until Saturday. But whether it's JG under center or it's Bailey or it's Harrison, the Vols quarterbacks have to take advantage of the Gators' pass defense as well. Florida's done a better job of late limiting big plays over the top, but they can be had down to down. 66th in the country in passing success rate defense. So it'll be important, I think, in this game when you're watching it, that Tennessee's good on early downs. I know Todd Grantham's defense hasn't been as good as they were last season, getting to the quarterback and creating some havoc. But the Vols have some protection issues in known passing situations. So the ground game has to be there, not only to keep Florida's offense off the field, but to at least allow some manageable situations on third down here. So if Tennessee's going to have a chance to stay within this number, Todd, they're going to have to be good on early downs, establish the ground game. If they're not, it could get a little bit ugly here. Obviously,
just run
game.
the Wildcat.
Yeah, there you go.
Just run the Wildcat all game with Eric Gray, and hope that worst case scenario, if you take knees, it impacts Florida's ability to score quickly inside of 2-3 minutes.
Have you heard anything on Garantano or who the quarterback at Tennessee that could be?
Nope, I have not. I tried to poke around amid some of those comments and wasn't able to come up with anything concrete. Have to, once we finish recording this fine show, poke around a little bit through some of my channels and see what kind of intel we can get there. I think there are Tennessee fans, though, who might be thrilled if it's not Guarantano because it means you could subtract an inevitable pick six that he seems to throw every week from the scoreboard. I will give Tennessee credit. I know they didn't get the cover last time we saw them against Auburn, but that was one of the more balanced attacks we've seen from the Vols in recent weeks. More than 200 yards rushing, more than 200 yards passing. If they're able to do anything close to that, you would think that they could stay inside this number that continues to climb against Florida on Saturday.
Absolutely. Big rivalry game. So, we made this game 17.2. So, now it's 17.5. Rivalry game, matchup. You could start to maybe make the case here. And I think this is a game that obviously the books will probably need as well. It looked like this one's going to see some lopsided action. But again, huge loss defensively with the suspension to Bennett. And then we'll have to keep our eyes and ears poked to the screen there and figuring out the QB situation for the Vols.
There is no doubt about that. This game, at least, Payne, should be a little bit more competitive within the Big 12. And right now we're looking at Iowa State, a 6.5-point favorite at FanDuel. Total in this game, 49.5, as they'll welcome in the West Virginia Mountaineers. And West Virginia, unfortunately, wasn't able to play their game against Oklahoma last week. Neil Brown talked about how his team might be better equipped dealing with the unexpected week off than they were earlier in the season. More or less indicating that, hey, look, we're going to be fresh. That's a positive. We're not quite sure how the 21-day layoff is going to impact us. but it's all about coming in, playing fast, executing early on, and that's going to be so important against an Iowa State team who appears to have finally found its swagger. They outlasted Texas last week, covered in the process, a game that took quite a bit of steam on game day as Iowa State ultimately closed a short favorite the day after Thanksgiving. Meanwhile, West Virginia, they do have a little bit of a vertical passing game, and I use that term relatively loosely, led by Jarrett Doege. He's got to be the complement to a powerful Letty Brown on the ground. When you look at Iowa State, we know about Breece Hall, I should say. Meanwhile, Brock Purdy has finally started to look like the quarterback all of us anticipated he was going to be. When you try and break down this game, does West Virginia have enough on the offensive side to allow them to stay in this football game from start to finish?
That's the big question. And I know we talked West Virginia football last week. We broke down that game ultimately before it was taken off the board. And the key factor in that game was the Mountaineers' offense, because we know how good West Virginia's defense is. And we said that last week. It's a requirement that West Virginia's defense has to be elite to kind of stay in these games and stay within the number. And that's going to be the same case here if they want to upset, Iowa State and Ames. Same thing applies. West Virginia's defense has been virtually elite all season. Third in passing success rate allowed. Opponents have been successful on 30% of their passes. That's it. Mountaineers are also 11th in explosive pass defense, 4th in EPA pass defense. So again, it's like a requirement that West Virginia's defense shows up here and plays to their level that they've played to all season to have a chance to beat Matt Campbell out right here. But offensively is where they're going to have to make some hay. It's going to be on Jarrett Doege. They're, I think, the biggest wild card, because when West Virginia's offense performs, they're like really, really tough to beat if you can get anything out of the offense. And you dig into some of the metrics, and there's some signs of life there. You mentioned Jarrett Doege. He's been pretty efficient down to down as a passer. His accuracy is damn good. And we joked last week he does have a pea shooter for an arm, but again, very accurate. Fortunately, I looked. There's no wind in Ames this weekend, so that's a positive. But throwing the ball, West Virginia's been successful in 45% of their passes. It's 35th in the country, pretty respectable. The area where Iowa State's defense that you want to attack is their secondary. 49th in passing success rate allowed. And, while West Virginia doesn't hit a ton of explosive passes because of, Doege's arm, Iowa State has had some issues stopping big plays, specifically early in the season. Then they cleaned it up a little bit. Then Texas hit them for a couple big plays over the top last week. But you put it all together, and Iowa State's defense also 49th in explosive pass defense, 50th in EPA allowed per pass. So I think Doege could have some success here, throwing the ball efficiently in that short to intermediate windows that he typically lives in. You look at Letty Brown, who you mentioned. We really like him. I think he's a very, very good back. He'd probably be even better if he had an offensive line that could get some push, and that's a little bit of a question mark for West Virginia's offense. 115th in the country in line yards. They're a better pass protecting O-line than they are in run blocking. But the one thing Letty Brown's been able to do is he's shown some ability, right, to pop a big run or two. So again, like I said last week, I wouldn't expect a lot of down-to-down efficiency on the ground. But there's potential here that Letty Brown could pop a big one. West Virginia's top 50 in explosive runs. And so I think that's the key here. We saw some money as we started recording this morning on West Virginia plus the 7. It's why we're off that key number now. But for West Virginia to pull this off, the defense needs to remain elite and then be competent through the air and then have Letty Brown hit one or two explosives, and that's how you're going to cover this number.
When you look at Iowa State, and I know they still have to win to try and officially secure passage to the Big 12 championship, do you worry a little bit from a situational standpoint that they won't be able to match the energy and intensity in this particular spot, knowing how important last week's game against Texas was, since the Longhorns were probably the team most capable of removing Iowa State from the playoff discussion?
I think that is a question mark. Now, obviously, we respect Matt Campbell, one of the best coaches and motivators in all of college football, and so he's going to say all the right things to keep his team motivated. And you also look at this program, right? This isn't a team that can afford taking weeks off. They out-execute you. They out-tough you. They out-prepare you. It's not a team that's absolutely loaded with talent where they can go through the motions and win games effortlessly like this. So that's the only thing. Like, does Iowa State no-show here? I wouldn't think so. But certainly coming off that huge Texas win, there's potentially some merit to that. The key to this, though, is, again, you mentioned West Virginia having 21 days off. It's not an explosive offense. It's more of a timing passing offense. Your hope is that West Virginia's timing to that short intermediate passing game early on isn't impacted by the large layoff.
Just find a little trick play or two. Dust it off, Neil Brown. Treat it like a bowl game. Let's go. Go out there. You got nothing to lose. Try and push your team to the limits in this particular spot. But should be a good game. As we know, Iowa State, a team that a lot of people wanted to write off for dead early on in the season when they lost at home outright as a 14-plus point favorite against Louisiana Lafayette. This looks a lot more like the Iowa State team most of us expected to see, and they continue to chase their first conference title since, I believe, 1912 or some ungodly year like that. Another program, though, that was dealt a little bit of bad luck in their quest to try and ultimately win a conference championship was the Indiana Hoosiers. Michael Penix lost for the season with a torn ACL, and that's the reason you see Wisconsin, a 14.5-point favorite, total of 45.5 at FanDuel for this weekend's showdown. Indiana, of course, still has a very realistic path to a Big Ten Eastern Division title if Ohio State isn't, because there is no Big East for college.
Well, you started chuckling before you said that. Yes. It's like you were trying to shit on the Hoosiers parade before it even started.
Oh, here we go. You know, when you look at Indiana, the reality of it is this has been a magical season, and you would have liked to see how things would have played out if they had their starting quarterback in Michael Penix. But Jack Tuttle will be the guy that assumes the reins. You look at the market, this number obviously took off a little bit. You saw some books open significantly higher, knowing that Penix wasn't going to be available. A quick backstory on Tuttle. He was nationally ranked the number 4 pro-style quarterback by Rivals and the number 5 pro-style quarterback by 24/7 Sports, coming out of Mission Hills back in 2017, received multiple Player of the Year honors in the San Diego area. Number 8 quarterback in the 2018 class, but amazingly enough, Payne, he wasn't able to crack the starting rotation at Utah for Kyle Whittingham, which raised a very interesting point that you said. All of these accolades are great for high school quarterbacks, but when a player has taken this long to reach the field, you begin to wonder why that may or may not be the case.
Absolutely. And I'm actually happy that we've talked Indiana football this much this season. I think we've talked about them virtually every single week. It's been impressive to me. It was a team that I kind of circled at the beginning of the season. I liked the coach. I liked their makeup. And oddly, and this is going to sound crazy, I've watched a piece of every single one of their games. It's the only team in the country that I've watched every single game this season. It's pretty wild. But you hit on this. It's going to come down to how good Jack Tuttle is. And we did text last night and joked around about how every quarterback in college football is like the next coming of Joe Montana. And we saw the same thing with Michigan and Joe Milton, like this 6'5" guy who's 240 and can throw. It takes 3 years to start. Like, he's probably not the guy. And so that's my hesitation here. I hope Jack Tuttle is the real deal. But like us, I think a lot of our listeners are going to hear and read this week that Tuttle's this 4-star kid and he has all the tools. And listen, that could be right. I hope it's true. We're going to find out, Saturday at 3:30 if he can play. He's obviously being thrown into the fire here against a ridiculously good Wisconsin defense. But there's, I think a reason it's taken Tuttle 3 years, transferring out of Utah and a torn Penix ACL to actually start. So, I have to see it first. And the one thing I think that we've been extremely constant and consistent with in breaking down Indiana is that, as special as the season's been, they have to beat you through the air because they can't really run the ball. It's been an offense.
Hey, they ran it last week against the Terps. They broke out, Payne.
They did break out against the Terps. Yes, that's a very stout defense the Terps have there. So, when you just look at how they're built, they're extremely reliant on, or were, Penix and Freifogel and Wapp and Hendershot. And past the talent at receiver, Indiana's offensive line is substantially better in pass protection than it is in run blocking as well. And so, you have to mention this because, you're making this road start at Wisconsin. It'd be nice to have some balance offensively. Hope and pray it happens. I just don't see that being the case. So to me, it's Jack Tuttle early and often making throws. If you look at Indiana's offensive line, 87th in line yards. So not a lot of push up front because Indiana at this point, they don't really stay ahead of the chains. If you look at first down runs, Indiana is 106th in the country in EPA per rush. Overall, 35% of Indiana's runs this year have graded successful. It's 115th in the country. There's no pop in the ground game either. 115th in the country in explosive runs. This has been an offense that's either pass or bust. And you're looking at Wisconsin right now, number 1 in the country in defending first down runs. You have a DC and Jim Leonard who I respect the heck out of. There was conversations about him coming to Florida State. I was pounding the table for that. It didn't happen. I know he's a safety, but he is aware that winning at the point of attack is how you have great defenses, winning that line of scrimmage. The sample size is extremely small. Wisconsin's only played 3 games, but the Badgers are number 1 in EPA rush defense on early downs as well. Wisconsin's defense, number 1 in rushing success rate defense. So this is going to be all in Jack Tuttle. And I don't know what he is, but the one area where Wisconsin's defense has looked somewhat human this season so far, it's only 3 games, they've given up some explosive plays. And they haven't really faced any elite offenses. Wisconsin's 36th in the country in explosive pass defense. So Jack Tuttle's going to have to hit some plays here through the air to stay within this number. I think Indiana's defense is going to have to play at or above expectation. And then Jack Tuttle's going to have to be consistent. That's really the chance they have to stay within this number. If you go out there, Todd, is this maybe a game you look to live bet? If you see Jack Tuttle confident early, maybe that'll give you some hope to back Indiana in game. If he's incompetent early, probably going to be a long day.
I mean, what's interesting, you talk about the caliber of opposition that Wisconsin has faced, and I don't think anybody is banging the table or lauding the offensive exploits of Illinois, Michigan, or Northwestern, especially the Wildcats in the wake of that debacle last week in East Lansing. By the way, thanks Michigan State for showing up against Northwestern, but not showing up against Indiana. That may be more just due with the Hoosiers than it is anything else, but I digress completely. Yeah, I mean, this Wisconsin team, it's one side that I'll admit that I've openly struggled with, and you talk about it only being 3 games, but who have they really faced? This is a step up in class for them defensively. The only other defense that they played with a pulse gave them a tough nut to try and crack in the form of the Northwestern Wildcats, and a big number for a low total, but a lot of it, as you mentioned, will hinge on Jack Tuttle and his ability to command the offense, especially if Indiana isn't able to run the football and shorten this game whatsoever.
We've been pretty adamant that while we like Wisconsin, we are not nearly as high on the Badgers as a lot of other sharp guys. A lot of other sharp guys had this as a top 5 team. I even saw someone have them at number 4. We've been reluctant. I believe we started them outside the top 10, gradually pushed them in. I'm not quite sure what they are. I'm really not. I wasn't overly impressed the first 2 weeks. Beating Illinois, as you alluded to, not that impressive to me. We know what Michigan is at this point. You had one real test at Northwestern. You stubbed your toe there. Your 5-star quarterback that everyone was ranting and raving about put up 7 total points. So I think we're still wondering what Graham Mertz is. So, this is a really interesting game. There's a lot of question marks specifically at both quarterback positions. One that I think we'll probably watch intently and try to figure out what these teams are moving forward, because there could be potential for some dramatic adjustments off this game for both teams.
Well, and I think one of the things that we talk about all the time, too, are power ratings aren't necessarily indicative of the overall style of play. And what I mean by that is that you could have a baseline power number that suggests Wisconsin should be, a 10 to 14 point favorite in this matchup, but the over-under tells you, hey, look, this may not be the kind of game where you want to run recklessly to lay those points. In a similar scenario, a game we didn't break down that you and I talked about at great lengths was Iowa in that same spot against Nebraska. A 12.5, 13-point favorite. You saw money on the dog, not because the power number for those two teams was wrong. It's just certain teams aren't built to run away and hide when they're laying this kind of aggressive number, especially within a league game.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. The other one thing that we have to look at here is, talked about Indiana's defense. I've been a little higher on them than just about everybody. They returned 8 starters, but they are a little light in the trenches. We've had some reservations about Wisconsin's run game not being up to par as past iterations. It looks like they got the young back involved here the last few weeks. He looks like a real player. that is one thing to note here, that Indiana's defense is a little undersized in the trenches. They're 62nd in EPA per rush allowed. So that will help Graham Mertz if the Badgers O-line can enforce their will in the trenches and get that ground game going a little bit more. That could be the other difference in separation in this game.
Should be interesting. Let's see how Indiana handles adversity. They've passed every test so far this season. A new quarterback under center. We'll see if they can answer the bell on Saturday in Madison. Last but not least, Payne, a game that we wanted to touch on in the SEC. It's Texas A&M, number 5 in the most recent college football playoff rankings. They remain unchanged. Going to need some help to get into the top 4. They're 6.5-point road favorites as they'll go on to the highway to take on the Auburn Tigers. Total in this game, 48.5 at FanDuel. And Payne, when you look at Auburn so far, this season has been as simple as figuring out where their games are going to be played. Much more competent and efficient when they play in their own building, less so when they go out on the road. And for those that watched the Iron Bowl last week, I'm not sure 42-13 was nearly as indicative of how lopsided that game was against Alabama. But before that particular contest, Auburn had been riding a 3-game winning streak, both straight up and against the spread. Meanwhile, on the other side, those of you that had Texas A&M, thoughts and prayers for that excruciating backdoor, a game that never felt competitive. A&M just wasn't able to run away and hide before winning by 13. When you look at the Texas A&M Aggies, Payne, and this has always been your knock on Jimbo Fisher, even when he was at Florida State winning a national championship, he wants to slow games down to a snail's pace. And the Aggies are 11th in the SEC in offensive snaps per game. And I think sometimes that can create a little bit of erratic behavior, so to speak, for an offense that can't really find its stride. They're number 1 in rushing yards per game and yards per attempt. Isaiah Spiller has been the workhorse. What does Auburn need to do from a defensive standpoint to keep this game close and maybe have a chance to pull off an outright upset at Jordan-Hare on Saturday morning?
So I initially saw this number and was like, Auburn's a little compelling here. Like it's on the lean list. Let's dig into this a little bit more. And then when you start to dig, you're like, oof. Auburn's defense was absolutely gutted this offseason. You lost some big-time NFL guys along the defensive line. You had opt-outs at linebacker. The secondary lost a slew of veterans as well, which is tough to replace when you play 5 DBs a lot. So to me, this is always going to be an uphill battle for Kevin Steele's defense this season. But it has to be better this week. There has to be some energy and effort, which when I watch Auburn isn't always there defensively. And I am stunned for a team that does recruit at this level, how ugly the defense has been. I was stunned. Like, I've watched them play a lot, and sure, I've dug into some of their games, but just looking at some of these metrics, it was stunning to me. And you mentioned Jimbo a little bit. His offense does operate at a snail's pace, always has. But A&M has, it's just so wild to me, right? This is a guy in Jimbo who prides himself on being the recruiting champion, and then he gets talent and it's like, why run 70 plays when you can run 49?
Grind it out, baby. Grind it out. Next time we're going to see Jimbo running the option instead.
It just drives me bonkers. But, for Auburn to cover this number or even pull off this upset, they have to close the gap here in this matchup on the defensive side of the ball. It's the largest area of concern. You dig in again to some of these metrics. Auburn's defense, 102nd in passing success rate defense. Kellen Mond in A&M's offense, 29th in passing success rate. With all those D-line guys moving on to the NFL, Auburn's 80th in the country in rushing success rate defense, and it's because they're getting pushed around in the trenches. They're 88th in defensive line yards. Auburn's 117th in stuff rate. You look at A&M offensively, 19th in rushing success rate. So another situation where they have an advantage. And so it just looks like down to down, A&M is going to be able to move the ball, methodically here. And when offenses do that, it's really important your defense makes some negative plays to create some long situations on 2nd and 3rd down. But unfortunately, Todd, Auburn's defense 94th in havoc rate. And, while we talk all the time about 3rd down conversions not always being predictive, and there's a lot of variance and luck because there's these huge swings year over year, for this season at least, that's where there's also this huge gaping difference between A&M and Auburn. Auburn's 118th in the country defensively in 3rd down distance to go. And it's because Auburn's being drubbed on early downs. Opponents' average distance to go on 3rd down against Auburn, 6 yards on average. You flip it around, A&M's defense, number 1 in the country, forcing their opponents into third and long. Average third down distance for A&M's opponents this season, almost 9.2 yards to go. So think about that. When Auburn's opponents are faced with third downs, they typically only need 6 yards to move the chains. When A&M's opponents need to convert on third down, they need almost 10 yards to extend the drive. So I think that's another thing to look for on Saturday. Which offense can be in third and manageable more often? Everyone, again, talks about third down conversions on this national level as you listen to like radio and television. But how good you are on third down is a byproduct of how good you are on early down. So I think that's really important to look at here. And if Auburn can somehow be good on early downs defensively and offensively, then they're going to have a chance to stay within this number. And again, knowing how slow Jimbo plays, it is tough to want to get out there and lay points on the road. I get it.
Does A&M have a legitimate path to getting into the college football playoff? In your mind, what needs to happen for the Aggies to be one of the 4 teams vying for the crystal ball in early January?
Yeah, that's above my pay grade. They're certainly at this point number 5 in the rankings. You think they're going to have to win out, I would guess, and hope for some carnage along the way. But
yeah, I was trying to figure out what kind of chaos they would need. Obviously, the first thing, they have to have Alabama beat Florida.
Yep.
To get Florida out of the mix because you have the head-to-head win, so that would eliminate the Gators. I don't know what needs to happen in the ACC title game. You probably need Notre Dame to blow out Clemson, giving Clemson, or not even blow them out, just beat them for a second time. Clemson with 2 losses, I don't think has a compelling enough resume to get in. And then even if Ohio State gets in, maybe A&M becomes the 4th team where you're talking about Notre Dame, Alabama, Ohio State, and the Aggies, 1 through 4. But
under
definitely
those scenarios, I think that's the path right there, is hope Notre Dame wins again in their rematch with Clemson. Hope that Ohio State doesn't have enough data points to be considered, and then handle your business and win games outright. And I think that's the way they can get in there, because even if, let me ask you this, if Florida wins out, what happens?
Yep.
If
Florida wins out,
and A&M
Florida
both
gets
win
in.
out. Okay, even though they lost head-to-head.
Yeah, because they'll have the win over Alabama as the last data point, and they'll be the conference champion.
That's true. Man, that's going to be a tough sell. That'll be the talk of the town for at least a week if Florida gets in over A&M.
I think that's the way it goes, because if you look at it, you go, well, Florida lost on the road to A&M, so they have that head-to-head win, but it was by a field goal on the road early in the year. Meanwhile, Florida beat Alabama, the same Alabama team that beat A&M by nearly 30 points. And I think ultimately the conference champion in the SEC gets in, and Alabama with 1 loss, if you're looking at them versus A&M for that spot, Alabama has the head-to-head win in dominant fashion against the Aggies. So
that makes sense.
Kind of my take. Not quite sure how it will unfold, but I know a lot of people are always looking to try and find that needle in a haystack. And of course, if you're betting Alabama, Clemson, or even Ohio State to a certain extent, you're not getting fair odds. If you think there's a path for anybody else, then it might be worth a small flyer to get some skin in the game. But let's just put it this way. A&M playing Alabama the second time around, I'm not quite sure would end up much better than it did the first time, unless A&M can get all the guys that opted out before the season to opt back in and get themselves into game shape in a span of about 7 to 10 days.
That was a team that could have really vied for a national championship. They lost a lot of talent via opt-out. It would have been fun to see what A&M, is and was if they had all their horses.
Well, we'll see. Jimbo's definitely building the program up, and for as bad as the energy sector has been, there still is a decent amount of oil money there, and I know A&M, we've always talked about potentially the sleeping giant in the SEC West, and a lot more reason to be optimistic about them being second in the pecking order behind only Alabama right now, because the more you watch LSU and you see what's going on in that program, I think that was a generation of sorts with Joe Burrow and Joe Brady. I'm not quite sure Edo keeps them as the second best team in the SEC West going forward.
Going to take a lot of work there. That's for sure. I mean, we talked about this with Coach O. He's more of a CEO. So he's got to bring in the right guys. You lose your DC, who's well respected. You lose your OC, who's the hottest offensive name in football. And you lose Joe Burrow. It's going to be tough to obviously overcome. And I believe I said earlier, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. 32-point difference.
Yep.
Between LSU year over year. So drastic drop there. That's for sure.
Let it be known for all of our young listeners out there and aspiring entrepreneurs, delegation is key. Surround yourself with good people and you can go far, whether it's in sports betting, or anything else along those lines. And one of the best ways to do so is by opening up your very own FanDuel Sportsbook account. Add a little excitement to your sports watching experience, as FanDuel has you covered from now until we crown a national champion, now through the Super Bowl, and now for as far as the sports calendar will take you. Right now, FanDuel is letting you place your first bet risk-free up to $1,000. Use the promo code BETTHEBOARD or BTB. Just place a bet on any game and FanDuel will refund you up to $1,000 back if you don't win your first bet. No strings attached. 21 plus, must be present in Indiana or Colorado. First online real money wager only. Site credit is non-withdrawable and expires in 14 days. Restrictions do apply. Responsible gaming. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Colorado, 1-800-522-4700. And Payne, we do have one final order of business to transact, and that, of course, is identifying our best investment opportunity for college football week. I don't know, whatever the hell it is. I'm just calling it December 5th.
Not the best of boards this week, and could be a touch of rain in this game. But let's go with 339 Georgia Tech plus 7.5 at FanDuel. What do you think about that?
You're on the Jeffrey Sims bandwagon? I mean, you've buried the hatchet, the fact that he spurned Florida State to take his talents to Atlanta, Georgia instead?
Actually, Mike Norvell spurned him, and it was for Luke Altmaier, who just decommitted this week. So, fun times there.
No, I get no problem with Georgia Tech. I think it's an interesting team who kind of had a month-long...
You better pitch that the right way. You don't
they had a month-long layoff. They came back with a vengeance in a 56-33 win last weekend against Duke. It was the most points the Tech had scored in a football game since 2018. The one common theme that emerged from that game, even leading up to it, was that the players felt refreshed. They were chomping at the bit to try and get out there. It was a young team that needed fall camp probably a lot more than most teams in the ACC. They've said all the right things about how they don't want to be a doormat. They see themselves as a middle of the pack team. Collins has them headed in the right direction. This is the kind of game on the road that I think you have to go out and win to try and steer your program in the right direction going into next season. Now, it does get difficult, Payne, because Georgia Tech's down one of their more talented playmakers in Jahmyr Gibbs. He left last week's Duke game, was seen on the sidelines in crutches. I don't think anybody believes he's going to be out there. But if there's a position that Tech has a few guys that they can lean on, it's probably the running back room. So I think they should be fine there. And when you look at NC State, I mean, you're not a huge Bailey Hockman guy. And so any chance we get to bet against Bailey, I mean, we have to take it, right?
7.5 is a large number to lay. They've covered this number, twice all season. So, I mean, Georgia Tech, not the best of road teams, but I do think there's value in this number. I do think Georgia Tech has a lot to play for here. Let's go ahead and take the 7.5 at FanDuel.
Yeah, the reality of it is Georgia Tech's got to protect the football. I mean, that's been their biggest problem all season long is turnovers. So if they're able to protect the ball, they have, in my opinion, a more explosive playmaker at quarterback. NC State's playing its 5th game in a row, so maybe you hope there's a little bit of that fatigue. They had to outlast Syracuse, and for those folks that didn't see how that game ended, I encourage you to go check that out on Instagram or the end. Syracuse football in a microcosm. You're inside the red zone, or at least damn close to it. You have one play left, and the quarterback on 4th down elects to spike it. So Dino Babers, good luck trying to resurrect that program. Eric Dungy doesn't have any eligibility left, but I digress. So Georgia Tech, I'm in full agreement with you, plus the 7.5. I think they're a more than a live underdog and would not be stunned at all if they go into Raleigh and win this football game outright.
What happened there at the end? And you're taking shots. The coach, he just needs a little more talent. He'll bring it in.
Who, Dino?
Yeah.
Well, Dino's going to have work to do. I don't think Syracuse is the easiest spot to recruit when you're talking about college football.
It's clearly not the easiest spot to recruit when you're talking college basketball either.
Well, that's what happens when you have a head coach that continues to hang on to the glory days of the program rather than handing off the baton.
Were we going to discuss this game that kicks off in about 3.5 hours? Sure, call.
I try and infiltrate the NFL podcast with college talk, and I normally try and silo the two because I know the NFL is your baby. I'm a bigger college football fan, or at least was until we started doing these podcasts a couple years ago, and that tune may have slightly changed. But sure, if you have any interesting nuggets or tidbits regarding the rare Wednesday getaway day football game, so to speak, between the Ravens and Steelers. And it looks like the Ravens thought they were going to have reinforcements. Those reinforcements didn't travel. What do you got for us, buddy boy?
There's really not much here. I haven't bet the game.
Oh, that's very helpful. Do you want to talk about the NFL game? Hey, Payne, what do you got for us? I don't have much, Bob.
I just felt like we should address it because it happens in about 3.5 hours. And, I'm sure the loyal listeners who listen immediately when this releases would like a little nugget or two. Here's the problem. I think it sounds great in general, right? Like you get double digits with Baltimore in a division game. It's this heated rivalry. The total's only 42.5. How can you not take the double digits? But eventually I think what ends up happening is Pittsburgh turns this into such a grinder and the short fields become pretty constant and Baltimore's defense just ends up breaking eventually, similar to what we saw in the Denver game last week. So, again, I haven't played this game yet, but looking at a Baltimore team that hasn't practiced since the 21st. And obviously, everyone knows they're dealing with COVID, but we've had it postponed. We're not sure when we're leaving to fly out. It was initially Monday. Then we have to wait for the snow to clear on Tuesday. There's a lot of disruption here. And I think the bigger part of this game, and a lot of people will be talking about Lamar Jackson and what the downgrade is to RG3, and certainly it is some. For me, the biggest thing is, what does RG3 have in front of him? You thought the two running backs were going to return. That was all the hype. They were going to fly out on a different plane. It doesn't appear like that's going to be the case. But even bigger than that is you look at the offensive line for Baltimore. We know Ronnie Stanley's out for the year. You lost Marshall Yonda to retirement. Matt Skura, Patrick McCarry, Will Holden are all out for this game. Your starting center, his backup. You have another rotational lineman that's questionable in DJ Fluker with the back injury. Talked about your fantastic blocking tight end who could have acted as a sixth lineman here. And Nick Boyle, he's out. Mark Andrews, your best pass catcher, and another helper along the offensive line is out. So I don't know how Baltimore is going to be able to protect up front or even establish the ground game to help RG3 out. And the one team I think that you would probably handpick not to play against with offensive line issues is Pittsburgh. So that becomes the difficult thing. We know how good the Steelers' front four is. Number 1 in the NFL pressure rate, number 1 in the NFL in pass rush win rate, top 5 in defensive rush efficiency, number 1 in early down success rate allowed. So you're probably not going to have a great chance to play ahead of the chains either if you're Baltimore's offense. So I haven't played this game, and it will shock some people. But I actually saw some early sharp money on Pittsburgh this morning, minus the 6 and minus the 10, as crazy as that might sound in a rivalry division game with the total of 42.
Sometimes you have to throw all the previous history out the window. I know the underdog has fared exceptionally well between these two teams, going 9-1 against the spread. And Pittsburgh, undermanned last year, found a way to keep it competitive in a similar spot, but a lot different dynamic in place. You could handle not having your quarterback and not some of your skill position players, but as you mentioned, being light in the trenches, this is not exactly the ideal matchup in the least. And since we've been recording this podcast for so long, Payne, we're seeing another wave of Coastal Carolina money coming in to further maybe potentially substantiate some of the things we discussed. So for all of our listeners, Lord only knows where that number will be when you finally listen. But
also, one thing there is there looks to be a little wind in the Coastal game. I'm seeing 18-mile-per-hour winds, gusts approaching 30 miles per hour. So in addition to potentially Malik Willis not being there, there is some wind, which also is impacting this total a touch, but more so the potential. Your boy Grayson McCall, get him going. That's my guy.
Get him going. All right, Payne Insider. You can follow him on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Go download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. Sign up. BTB. Bet the Board. Your promo codes. $1,000 risk-free bet. Take full advantage of those promotions. And Payne with a Georgia Tech ticket plus 7.5. Come Saturday afternoon. We'll see all of our listeners at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.